Okay, I'm joined at the ANU here with Dr Andrew Carr from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, and we're discussing the broad theme of do the humanities help us understand politics? So welcome Andrew and thanks for your time. Do you have any thoughts just on that opening statement? Do the humanities help us understand politics?
Fundamentally, the humanities is a vital discipline for politics. Politics could be seen in terms of how many votes you get, whether your popularity is 60% or 30%, whether you passed Rule A or Rule B. But none of those factors matter unless you have the wider context of the debates that we have. We have politics because there are disagreements between humans, disagreements that go to our values, our identity, our understanding of history, the type of community and society we want to live in, and the role of human psychology that kind of drives those challenges and those contests between people. And that's why politics matters, and that's why it is so fundamentally immersed within the humanities. We try and count kind of surface level phenomena, but having 60% of the population in support of you doesn't mean anything unless you know what they're actually in support of and why they're in support of you, and how people actually go about supporting particular politicians or particular ideas, and where they get those ideas from. So the humanities and history really drives a lot of our work.
Yeah, well, just building on that, the humanities are often stereotyped as dissecting crime and punishment and poring over, the inner struggles of Raskolnikov, and politics more as Anthony Green looking at swing margins and those sorts of things. But really, the swings and the margins are just the symptoms. But is it more the humanities that drives politics and drives political change?
Fundamentally, because politics is the study of people. It's a study of psychology. It's a study of order, of values, and the way that people approach these challenges when they don't have easy access to resources that kind of guarantee them. They have to find ways of cooperating, and answers to how we might cooperate, answers to how people interact and what will lead them into conflict situations or lead them into peace situations, for those of us who work in strategic studies, can be found as much within Thucydides and Herodotus as it is in the latest journal article that came out last week. And so we use a lot of these ancient resources because they're still talking about people, and they may get to fundamental insights that are just as relevant today.
So you mentioned Thucydides, and I noticed he's on your shelf here behind us. Your area is strategic defence, and if we look at one of the most pressing issues in strategic defence, it would be the rise of China and security in the Asia-Pacific in general, especially now that the US's hegemony has been challenged somewhat. And this debate is often framed in terms of economics, in terms of raw military data, but to what sense or to what extent do you think it is still relevant to understand Thucydides and Herodotus? Is it still relevant to these modern debates?
It's extremely relevant. Political scientists have been studying what's called the Thucydides trap in recent years. And that is, Thucydides observed that for all the debates about particular areas of control and identity in ancient Greece, he analysed the conflict as coming down to the fear that Sparta had about a rising Athens, and that was what was the fundamental cause of the war. And so a lot of political scientists have gone and said, well, how often has a rising power caused an established power to have that same fear? And they apply that to the contemporary world. The United States is the established power, and it's concerned about the rise of China. And sometimes in our past, such as with America and Great Britain in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century, you have a peaceful transition between one great power to the other. But in a lot of times it actually does lead to conflict. And so the numbers tell us something. But just as important, we need to understand the history, the culture, the identity of these places. Thucydides kind of rightly noted that not only was one a rising power and one an established power in ancient Greece, but that Athens was a naval and maritime power and Sparta was a land power. So different societies have different cultures, and we have a term called strategic culture, and that is, do countries actually think about strategic issues like how to fight a war in the same way? And actually the argument is they probably don't, and I think history and identity is a very big lens for us to try and understand these issues. And so going back to Thucydides, you kind of see these frameworks that you can at least say, is this a good way to understand a contemporary conflict? For all that is changed, for all that is rapidly different, and that's one of the challenges of trying to use history and use it in an informed sense. And so the work of very good historians is very important to correct our way, that we don't just willy-nilly pick up frameworks and apply it, but trying to work out how have we kind of been in situations like this before, how have earlier kind of predecessors resolved these challenges, and what lessons can we learn for trying to deal with today's problems.
Now, you're the author of Winning the Peace, and there you go, you can promote that there. Available at all good bookstores. Now, in the introduction you mentioned that this has come out of your PhD thesis, so I'm interested to know, in creating this work, what role did the humanities play? And obviously you would have been reading a lot of more hard-nosed strategic defence stuff, but as a PhD student, were you reading a lot of stuff from the humanities, and did that help ultimately shape the work?
I think this work was really informed by me being a failed philosopher. I love reading philosophy. I find the debates absolutely fascinating. I couldn't do it as an academic career, but a lot of the same concepts I think apply in the international sphere. Countries have standards of behaviour, of norms, and these ideas flow between different countries, and that's kind of what I follow in the book. How has Australia promoted particular ideas to Southeast Asia on security issues and on economic issues? How are ideas accepted? How do you convince someone and persuade someone to your point of view? And so that's what I've kind of traced at the diplomatic level between states. And that's something that kind of goes back to my reading of Plato and trying to understand these issues. It goes to my reading of Hobbes and trying to say, well, in a situation where there is no order over the top, how do countries work out a way to cooperate with each other without finding themselves kind of running into conflict and falling into warfare? And so that's not just then philosophy, but also what can history tell us? And so I draw on a lot of kind of regional history to try and understand how governments of Southeast Asia and people of Southeast Asia engage with these issues. But also as well kind of the role of literature and psychology, and trying to understand why countries might see it something as being in their interest. Trade liberalisation makes everyone kind of more prosperous, and yet still rejected on grounds of that's not an idea associated with our culture or our way of life, and the difficulty of what's perceived as Western ideas moving into Asian environments or Pacific cultures. And those can be overcome, but you have to have a good understanding of the culture, but also the kind of challenges that new and different ideas present, and the way people kind of incorporate those ideas into their existing framework. And that's something that the humanities really helps open up and lets us understand in a way that the pure numbers just simply can't explain.
My own area is history, and over the last couple of years there's been a lot of commentary, almost amazement, about the hung parliament in 2010 and now the high turnaround rate of prime ministers, as if this has never happened before. And of course we had a hung parliament in 1940, and in the early days of federation especially we had a lot of merry-go-rounds in terms of prime ministers. Do you think the electorate needs a good knowledge of history to be able to make informed choices? And do you think if the humanities were more widely promoted, you would have a better democracy, whatever that means? And perhaps, or to put in the negative, do you think there are ramifications if you have an electorate coming up to key elections such as this year, if there isn't a broad base of understanding from the humanities and specifically history?
Well, I'd say they have to study politics first, but I would place politics in the humanities. I think it very much draws on the same kind of intellectual lineage, and democracy in some ways is about who has the power, who has the numbers. but it's also about what kind of a community do we want, and recognising the equality between individuals, that you have a say and I have a say. And having a citizen body that is informed and engaged, recognises their responsibilities to the society, as well as the kind of rights and protections they are offered by that, I think is fundamental to a well-functioning society. And that's one of the real challenges of the modern world, that how do we get people who are citizens in the larger sense of the word, who understand how to engage and are able to engage, feel empowered to engage, and that has a system that then is seen to reflect their ideas and their values. And that's a question that you can answer in a very strict thing. There's voter ID laws that cause problems here, and there are disenfranchised voters because of poverty or other circumstances there. But more so, it's about the way that people identify with the society, the role of their nationalism and kind of patriotism, the education basis that they have, and their desire and willingness to be involved in those societies. And that's where the humanities is so vital for understanding those questions. And they're the ones that, if you address them properly, then you can have stable, functioning societies that can have great debates over how a society should be operating, what kind of values it should have, and everybody wakes up tomorrow and it's been a safe environment. If you get it wrong, then it's very easy for these things to spill over to violence in the streets and bloodshed and the military kind of being involved. And so these are the kind of challenges that politics really wrestles with at heart, and for which the humanities is important for understanding.
Robert Menzies is the longest-serving Australian Prime Minister, will probably never be beaten his long record. Now, you've published on Robert Menzies, and his spectre looms large over the Australian political landscape, and he's got a very contested legacy between quite different factions in the Liberal Party. Do you think you can understand a figure like Menzies, who's been so formative on the Australian political landscape, without understanding people like John Locke and Mill, and even back to Machiavelli?
Not really, no. I mean, Menzies is a fascinating figure, and not just as important in terms of understanding him, but understanding the way his legacy then drives the actions of other politicians. That we have these ideas about how society operates, and whether those ideas are true or not, often a lot matters are based upon those ideas. So I referred earlier to, is there going to be conflict between the United States and China? Because our ideas tell us that there's a chance that it is, or we might suspect there is, people often tend to have then seen evidence that they're acting in a more aggressive way, because people are anticipating that kind of a conflict. And so our ideas about the past directly inform our actions in the present. And I think Menzies is an example of that. His ideas about the type of society that Australia was, the type of society should be, famously were held even after the ground had started to fundamentally change under his feet in terms of the identity of the Australian public, the role of Australia in the modern world and the Asia Pacific, its economic basis and organisation, and yet he still held on to these kind of 17th century and 18th century ideas of England that then directly informed his kind of picture of Australia. And we have ideas about Menzies that then directly inform how we think and act today. And so recognising that lineage, I think, is very important for understanding the context, and not kind of falling to easy stereotypes about that he was this simpleton holding on to just a love of the Queen, as if an infatuated kind of young Romeo. That's a wrong picture of the man, and you don't kind of understand why he was so successful if that's your worldview.
Absolutely. And we'll finish with this question. There's a lot of talk of the humanities being in crisis. It would be interesting to get your thoughts. Do you think that it is in crisis? And if so, what is the nature of it? Is the crisis that humanities students don't have a ready career path at the end of a humanities degree? Is the crisis that the value of humanities degrees aren't being recognised in a way they once were? And do you think that digital humanities is the saviour of the discipline?
That's a really important question. I certainly don't have the answer to it. I think one of the challenges for the humanities is making sure we're speaking to the public, that there's a huge demand for these kinds of issues. You know, if you go into a bookstore, the non-fiction section, the history section in particular is huge. Most of a bookstore is fiction, literature, often a big role. People want to engage with this kind of material, and so I think the challenge for academic people in the humanities is to make sure that we're talking and writing on issues that matter to the wider public, and doing so in a way that actually can engage them. We're not just trying to talk to ourselves. I think that would be a betrayal of the kind of opportunities that we have. Moving digitally is important to kind of make that more accessible, but I think it really starts with us saying, why does this discipline exist? Why is this role important? And focusing on those core questions. And I think every generation ends up talking about those big questions and sometimes kind of repeating themselves and readapting to new circumstances. But it's that debate that's actually really important to a society and really healthy for a society. And so I think that's the kind of fundamental challenge. You know, it's easy to spend a lot of time just kind of focused on your career path and publications for other academics, but it's too important to just kind of leave to the academy in that way. And I think if we do that, the clear interest in these issues from the general public will lead to much greater engagement, will lead to greater valuation of the humanities as a kind of skill and development, both for citizens but also for kind of employers, in terms of this is a well-rounded individual who understands how to contribute. So I think the change starts with us.
That's an excellent point to end on. Dr. Andrew Carr, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.